Thank you. So it seems that we have everyone. If I've missed you, please feel free to go ahead. No? Okay. Um, one of the first things that we always do when we start and any event is the recognition of where we're at. But I think we always try to do in a really mindful way, not just like a token way of saying, oh, we are in Treaty 6 territory, this being indigenous land, and pass the page. But rather being mindful of being a human rights organization, what does it mean for us to do work in from as Kachios and what does it mean to recognize the colonial past of Canada, but also the colonial present of Canada in terms of the violation of human rights, discrimination, and our purpose as an organization. So we want to recognize that we're here on Treaty 6, that we strive to do all our work from a decolonial lens and establish right relations around in where we're at and around the country. So with that, I also want to frame the stride work and the advocacy work that we do within this context. And I'm gonna pass it to Renee, who is gonna go farther into the advocacy work we do. Thank you so much for being. And I think that what my reflection when I was hearing your introduction is the breadth of your experience is it resembles the breadth of the need we have. We are getting cases from all over the spectrum about discrimination and concerns of people in all those fields that you described, from education to fitness to police to everywhere. There is everywhere. And so having you and having your experience is an amazing possibility for these people. And we hope we can connect those two.
Awesome. Thanks, Angelica. And we also have Danielle on. She says she's a student at the First Nations University Canada and is here to gain new skills and knowledge. Welcome, Danielle. And Sheba, who's, I think you read that, with Action Dignity. So welcome, everyone. As I mentioned, my name is Renee Bourgeois, and I guess I'm here to kind of give the larger content of the discussion today and give you a bit of a framework about who we are, what is this all about, what kind of needs we have, and how will we start to engage you as a volunteer. Now, this is a logo mess soup, I know, but I think this is a really important slide because the history of the John Humphrey Center for Peace and Human Rights, just for those of you that don't know, John Humphrey was the principal drafter of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights after the Second World War, and he was a Canadian lawyer. And he came back in 1966 once the International Bill of Rights kind of finally got moving at the United Nations and came back to Canada and started a Human Rights Education Foundation. So we're actually an offshoot of that work way back when. But our mandate is really human rights education, creating spaces of peace building. We're really having difficult conversations on really challenging human rights issues and building forward solutions in our community. And we do that with adults and young people, you name it. But over the years, given our name, we've had many people come to us with human rights concerns, and it's always been very challenging because we were always stuck with our mandate in some ways of being an education organization, but didn't want to leave people falling through the cracks. So over the years, we've worked really hard to build relationships, and this kind of, over the last number of years, we really worked to evolve this program called Stride, which was really an effort to build a network of like advocates at a community-based level, but also advocates across the province. Because those of you that maybe have participated in the Human Rights 101 trainings and stuff, as we've talked about, is that when we talk about human rights, there's the different levels, the community level, municipal level, a very colonial term, but the provincial level, all very colonial terms, and national level. But those are all the different levels where there's legislation that affects all of us, and we need to be able to engage. So we have all these advocates that we've been building networks across the province, but these are all the organizations that are part of that and who've been part of this movement to build and work together and fill the gaps groups, and we all play different roles. The Coalition for Justice and Human Rights is kind of like more of the overarching organization working to hold the advocacy side of things. And many of these organizations are partners involved in the coalition, but it's also much bigger. So we've been working with like Takalusa Institute, for example, which is representative of the Black Muslim Somali community, the Epistemiques White Buffalo Trailblazers down in Lethbridge, the Alberta Hate Crimes Committee, which is a provincial organization. They will have a lot of like complaints come into them, reports of hate. And often when they need a response, for example, this week we've had 3 come in from Stop Hate AB that are really quite complex, and also involving law enforcement, which is challenging in of itself. But we as Stride kind of support people who need support potentially through the Alberta Hate Crimes Committee, and the Hate Crime Committee supports the efforts. So there's all these organizations. The Elizabeth Fry Society has been remarkable in kind of being a trauma-informed space that will do intake and support people who have really, really complex needs. And a lot of our other partners here. So I'm not going to go through them all because I realize we're on lunch break and we gotta move forward and talk about the details. But just so you get a picture of all the groups that are involved and part of this, it is a coalition across different backgrounds, perspectives, experiences, and I think that's what's beautiful about it, is it's an intersectional space where we're working together and holding each other. So just so you know, though, a little bit about Stride advocates, and you know, our goal, what we call Stride advocates, are those folks that are part of this program who just make a commitment to this ongoing learning, but also to really be supports in our communities. And this was the group had developed this last year in terms of who we are. So our goal as advocates is to document human rights related concerns, because we really feel that it's critical to document human rights concerns to be able to monitor and to influence policy that affects those most marginalized in our community. But we also want to make sure that community members have a space where they feel heard, believed, and not alone. It's that in and of itself is a huge mental health support to people. But we really want to work together as a team. And as Angelica said, we have all these diverse experiences that we can work together to make sure that we support people to get their desired outcomes. So we seek not to be their voice, but really kind of to walk alongside them to find and meet the goals that they may have in their advocacy. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. And we've been really lucky. The Edmonton Community Foundation here in Edmonton and the City of Edmonton allowed us to start this and pilot it in Edmonton a few years ago. And we've been able to get support from the Government of Canada to take us to March 2021, but we're making good progress. I think we'll have a strong network and be able to continue to go regardless. This is why this volunteer orientation is critical. Okay, so just so you know, how do people connect in with us? The people connect in with us in many, many different ways. They connect in with us via the different organizations that come there. As I mentioned, the Alberta Hate Crimes Committee. This morning, we just had a complaint come in from the Coalition for Justice and Human Rights website. They have a form on there, but they reached out to the different groups on Facebook. So there's many different ways that people come in. We kind of act as this hub of people needing support and being able to mobilize around it in different ways. The way that we, though, connect with people as advocates has kind of emerged and evolved quite a bit over the last little while. Of course, we do communicate with email with people, but we've been using, just the biggest thing that we wanted to get across here is when you're going to be doing your advocacy, we've set up MightyCall, it's called. It's an online call center space where we would add you as a user so that you can have an app on your phone, or you can use your computer to call people, but have anonymity. I can't speak today. So just as been a bit of a buffer and protection mechanism to make sure that advocates' information is protected, and you know that you have the choice of when your personal information is shared. Because we have had experiences in the past as this was emerging where, for example, one person did an intake call and would have that person calling them at 11 o'clock at night. So we really just kind of want to build the right protection mechanisms around to have communication, but to also respect everybody's privacy. Okay. Angelica, have I missed anything yet? No, okay. So just to give you kind of a quick rundown of the structure, like, and how we're organizing. So at the center of all this volunteer organizing, we have a volunteer management team, and that kind of includes community organizer leads, which I'll talk about in a second, as well as kind of key community partners like the Coalition for Justice and Human Rights, Self-Advocacy Federation. That's a space where we're you know, trying to hold the volunteer management and make sure that cases are moving and that we're providing the right supports as we move forward. We do have a community organizer down in Calgary, Ivana, who's on the call here. You met her. She's kind of like that center point, like being that holder of all the information, making sure cases are managed, making sure there's follow-up happening with cases, and communicating with you as volunteer advocates. Then we have these volunteer advocates across the community, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. So we have a couple of different response spaces. We have Ivana in Calgary. In Lethbridge, we do have a really solid team in Lethbridge. Yiwei Chen is a law student here at the U of A who's kind of acting as that case management person and supporting the team in Lethbridge. We also have a community organizer here in Edmonton. We actually have two through the Coalition for Justice and Human Rights, and that's Yovella Mizrahi and Kelsey Fortier. And then our community, we also, the John Humphrey Center, after when COVID started this Facebook group called the YEG Community Response to COVID-19. And it blew up. There's like thousands and thousands of people on this page. And we've had some seriously complex cases come in through this page. For example, one gentleman who was like homeless for 15 years and physically disabled living in his van. And we've been able to get him housed, working with Elizabeth Fry. So Annie Mushtaq, who's on the call here too, is the lead of this team. And Annie's been playing a huge role in helping us build this infrastructure. So huge kudos to the organizers. Okay, so now we're going to talk about like, what's your role? What would you be doing with the coalition? And as I mentioned, like the biggest with this work with Stride, the biggest thing, as I mentioned, is we want to document. We know that so many of the human rights issues that we have in our communities and our province, that they're starting to surface now, but it's just the surface layer. And honestly, some of the cases that have been coming into us lately are really intense. And so we will work to make sure that we're, finding the right people to support cases, because some of them are quite complex. But there's this piece where we really need to, one, do the intake and really document it with people, but also really find out, like, what is their end goal? What do they want to get out of it? And we'll talk about that a little bit more when we go over some cases in a few. But really what this will happen is, ideally, we always want to kind of have teams working in two, where there you can kind of support each other in this process. And when you'll arrange a call with this individual. We used to do this face to face, but in some ways calling is working good because it's responsive and it's not trying to get everybody's schedule. Seems more complex these days, but you'll meet with this person and we have like a simple form that you go through and you just talk to them, like, what happened? Do they feel they were discriminated against? If so, why? How has it impacted them? What do they want to see as an outcome? And some people don't always want to file formal complaints, which is totally cool. But at the same time, we are, however, documenting this stuff so that we can make sure we can document these systemic trends in the long term and in the shorter term and inform policymakers. And I'll talk again more about some examples of that as we move forward. Immediately what you'll do following is you'll share your notes. So one of the team members has to be really good at documenting, like writing it down, typing it out. The other person can focus on the conversation. So you really need good notes. That's so critical. Like, we've done some intakes where the notes aren't done very well, and it's horrible because we have to go back and have another conversation. And ideally we want to walk out of there with as much as we can. And in the cases, we want to let people talk it off their chests and just, allow them to be heard. And that's a kind of the critical piece, but there are questions to guide you forward. You'll share them with a lead advocate that will be kind of connected with you in advance, and the community organizer, and then you'll have a debrief call with that lead advocate. That's something we're going to kind of make sure we always do. It just helps you process it, and it helps us kind of figure out how can we support this and what do we need to take as a next step. And then at that point too, if they're in a situation where maybe they need food or something immediately, that we'll just kind of make sure we connect them to those resources and get them taken care of. The community response page that we have on Facebook is a great place if we have somebody who needs like immediate food or something that we can post on there as advocates, and usually the community will pick it up and fill it right away. And we also have a partnership with the food bank for food, which is great. Okay, so that's the first step, is like this intake process. But our hope is like when we match you to a case, we want you to stick with that case. It's like we want to see you kind of be able to continue and walk forward. So in that case, after our debrief, we'll talk about maybe what needs to happen. Maybe a letter needs to be drafted, or yes, they want to do a formal human rights complaint. So we'll actually work together as a team to draft the human rights complaint or whatever complaint it is for the person, and then we'll share it back to them to provide feedback. But we'll also write letters. For example, we had a company in Calgary reported recently that has been doing some fraud stuff with the CERB and homeless folk. And so we wrote letters, for example, to the MLA, to the MP, just to get the word going. It's like this advocacy strategy. While we want to file formal complaints, we also really want to make sure that we're advocating in the different ways that we need to move the process forward. Sometimes we'll need to do research, and sometimes we can, as a team, we'll discuss and we'll say, oh my gosh, this is a perfect client for Elizabeth Fry. Let's connect them with them, and they'll take the case and move. So it'll all depend on the case, and they're all very, very different, as you'll see in a minute. This one I'm not going to talk a huge amount about, but what's happening is there are teams emerging that have been working together and that continue to emerge around really systemic issues that have come out in the work. And some of those systemic issues, just so you can see, of course, policing here in Edmonton, there is a solid team working on policing issues in Edmonton. There has been a group really mobilizing, working around prisons for a couple of years. They need, the thing with each of these teams is they need strong folks that can facilitate and help organize and move the groups forward. What I find is I've become always the leads. People want me to facilitate and lead, and I can't do it. I'm burning out to no end. But these groups are super important. Like we have seniors. Some of you may have seen in CBC a couple of weeks ago, we had an Indigenous senior pass away, and there was a lot of issues there in terms of language rights and that. So we have these systemic issues. And so if there are those of you that you have really solid facilitation and organizing skills that way, feel free to connect with me. We can talk more about that, because we do need supports in these areas. And then the last piece as advocates that you could possibly do, and we would reach out to, is that sometimes what we need witnesses. We need people just to be present with people at different things. So for example, in Lethbridge, we've had advocates go to court cases and just be present there while the court cases was going through. We've done that here in Edmonton. And really our intention with that is to really make sure that there's a known presence of community support behind people. Or when we have somebody go to, say, a human rights conciliation meeting to support somebody who maybe is English is their second language and they don't feel comfortable going into human rights conciliation on their own. And somebody to be present, but also somebody for that person to maybe debrief with, take a break with, and talk about. So this is something else that we do. Okay. We're coming near the end. How are we doing for time, Angelica? We're okay. Okay. So what we wanted to do is I wanted to kind of take you through some of the case studies that we've had, just to kind of give you an example of things that come our way and kind of what we did and how we went through it. So prior to COVID, we were doing these clinics in different communities where we would just have like an open space at a specific time, like for example, the Calgary Library, and just people could come in and bring complaints forward. So this one, there was a woman who came in and she had been struggling with over a year of really clear discrimination. She had started to document it quite well. So the first step with her is we sat down with her, we kind of articulated her whole complaint, we identified kind of what she wanted to get out of it, where she wanted to go. she wanted to file a human rights complaint. She was very clear on that. So we worked and supported her take that. We took that intake form, which is really modeled after the human rights complaints form, and we drafted the whole thing for her. We sent it back. She's able to look at it, and then she articulated and built it out a little bit more. And then she started adding some evidence to it, and we finalized the draft with her, and it was up to her to send it off. We helped them draft it, but it was kind of up to her to send it off, unless they say, yes, please do it for us. We tend to kind of defer to let people send it themselves. So that was an example of one in the workplace. We get quite a few in the workplace, and we get and it is nice to hear somebody about unions, because we've been getting a lot of concerns and issues around unions, and I don't have the knowledge in that area, but it's an area where we need to like strengthen our knowledge base and understand how to navigate that a little bit, because we're finding often unions, people are really struggling with being represented in unions. Here's a second one, and this was a really interesting one too. This was an Indigenous elder who worked in a corrections facility and had experienced pretty intense trauma. Enough that it was intense trauma, but when she reported, she was kind of pushed out of the institution. She wasn't believed, and they just kind of blocked her. And so she had been carrying that for a number of years. For a human rights complaint, you only have 1 year to file a complaint. And she had been carrying it for a number of years. So she was kind of beyond that point, but she didn't really want that. We documented her issue, but what she really wanted was she wanted ceremony. She wanted to get back into that institution and have the opportunity to have Indigenous ceremony there, a calling back ceremony to her spirit. And so we did that. We worked with her to like secure access to the facility. We supported her. She knew an elder that she felt comfortable, and we supported her in bringing that elder up from Calgary, and just supported her in hosting that. And that was all we had to do for that case. And she's, we just really kind of supported her needs in that case. And that's what I mean is what we do and the process we take is different on everything, because everybody's different, but it's about us as community just being ready to walk with people and support them in that journey, so that, and going through that process and journey is healing in and of itself. Here's a one that came in via the Facebook group. There was a woman who was reaching out consistently over an online application form, and she seemed desperate. She was applying 2-3 times a day for hot meals with this one of our partners. And it was really clear she was desperate. So we didn't have a phone number for her. She had no phone number. She couldn't afford it. So we mobilized some volunteers to go to her address and connect with her and talk with her. And we've ended up connecting her to Elizabeth Fry for support, but also got her connected to the food bank so that she's getting regular food and stuff. So each of these is very different. This one, and this was the one I brought up earlier via the COVID page, is we had this gentleman who, he had been 15 years homeless, 15 years living in his van, in his car, and physically disabled. COVID, he couldn't access sanitation facilities, water facilities. He couldn't access the expo center because the expo center, they hadn't thought about wheelchairs. But the other thing they hadn't thought about is they hadn't thought about people pulling up in their own vehicles. They expected everybody to come over transit or via the shelter buses. So this gentleman tried to go to the expo, but one, he couldn't get in because of the wheelchair at first, but the second, he couldn't get in because nobody knew he was out there needing the wheelchair in the first place, because it's quite a jaunt into the expo center. So we were advocating and working to kind of alleviate that issue of accessibility at the expo center, but then also working with him to make sure we could connect him to the right housing supports. And so somebody at Boyle and at Bissell, and eFry worked together to make sure this guy got housed. And then we used that Facebook group to furnish his house with his whole shopping list. And this guy's housed after 15 years, which is absolutely remarkable, because he was faceless really in this whole journey. And he connected via JHC with a Facebook message. I remember, I think it was wild. And here's a third one, the final one I'll share with you. And it just shows you how like the breadth of issues that people are coming to us with. And I know some of these people who go like, well, is that human rights? And it's hard because human rights is so all encompassing. It's about our health. It's about our well-being. It's about access to our basic needs. It's about discrimination. It's so much more than just discrimination. But we had this one come in from a gentleman who was under a lot of mental distress and stuff. He had some run-ins with the city bylaws where they removed a bunch of his property from his yard, and he has problems with hoarding. And so we've been kind of working as a liaison with the city to help figure out how he can claim some of his property back, although they just take it all right to the dump. So all they can do is give him some money. So it's been heartbreaking for him, but we're also trying to connect him to the right supports, people who can help him with the hoarding and the mental health. So often, sometimes these cases, they're like 2 or 3 weeks. We transition and connect them in, and they're done, and we're done. Sometimes they're cases like we've had cases that have been months. They're all very unique and different in what we do. So kind of the last pieces is like the volunteer requirements. The pieces that we're hoping everybody will have is, I know everybody should have received like the advocate assessment. For those of you that did that, thank you so much. That just helps us to see like, where are people's skills and what is your experience, like law enforcement, child welfare. So when we have a complaint and come in, we can easily triage and see who we can access and ask for support. So that's a really important thing. We have a confidentiality agreement, kind of like a volunteer agreement, just in terms of like everything that we do has to be fully confidential among anybody outside of like our team. Like we need to make sure we can talk to each other about it. That's why we want to debrief and talk about cases, but there's this real, you know, sensitivity around confidentiality that we'll get you to agree to. And it's also a recognition about working together under trauma and stress and how difficult that is and how open-hearted we need to be in that journey. We'll also do vulnerable sector checks. We will cover any costs for that. We are working right now through Volunteer Alberta to try and get a waive of the costs for vulnerable sector checks, but in the meantime, we'll just kind of cover those costs. And then we have like, what you'll find is we'll let you know about ongoing trainings that we have, that please feel free to join. Please do join. What we talk about, like today, actually yesterday, we just went through all the formal human rights complaint processes in Alberta, for example, and walked through the human rights complaint process all the way to the tribunal. So it's a space for us to learn and talk about together, but I'll show the two coming up. And then you'll find that like a 1 and 2 hour a week contribution will be good for like one case. We try to want to keep people down to like 2 cases each, but this is all emerging. I will warn you, this volunteer strategy and everything we're doing is all emerging, because we were managing and building a good system, but when COVID hit, we've been hit really hard. So we've realized we've had to really mobilize and build a solid volunteer structure due to the demand. So some of the trainings we have coming up, Chad mentioned that he's done the rights and policing one with us. Chad, we love you. And we also have next week with Rocky Ward, who's on here, appreciative and active listening and advocacy. This is a really critical kind of core one around how do you sit through maybe discomfort and really be there for the person that you're there documenting with or listening to. So Rocky, thank you for leading that one. And then in a couple of weeks, we have our Human Rights 104. We have 102, 101, 102, 103 on our YouTube page, and we can share those out if you want. But this one is really, the first 3 was all about the human rights architecture and the different complaint processes and mechanisms. And now at this last one, we really want to talk about alternative advocacy strategies. So, you know, if a human rights complaint process isn't where it's at, or maybe we want to get movement faster, how do we do that? How do we really build an effective advocacy strategy and push it forward? And I'll be running that one with Roxanne Ulinicki, who is a disability rights advocate here in Edmonton, and she's a rock star. She's been part of JHC for about 11 years and has a lot of really valuable contributions, particularly when we're looking around disability. All right.